Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Supply Chains and Logistics, COVID-19 and the Future. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We'll first hear from our speakers and then have a short Q&A session. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's panel by typing your questions into the box found on the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them after the webinar. I would now like to introduce our speakers for today's event. First, we will hear from Michael Cossetto. Michael heads up Bartier Perry's corporate and commercial group and advises on a range of commercial transactions. He has a special interest in licensing and distribution and regularly advises clients about supply chain issues with a focus on the FMCG sector. Over the last few months, he has been assisting clients navigate through various COVID-19 related supply chain issues. We will then hear from Michelle Schäuble. Michelle has 25 years of experience working in the international logistics and supply chain industry, both in Europe as well as in Australia. He is an expert in delivering successful project transport solutions for very challenging, oversized and heavy lift cargo, and focuses on educating importers and exporters on how to minimize their risk profile along their supply chain. So, without any further delay, over to you, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Over the last few months, I've been advising businesses about supply chain issues that have arisen primarily as a result of COVID-19. We first started seeing issues in about January of this year when factories in China closed. This had an immediate impact on businesses that were receiving supplies from Wuhan and other regions in China that were shut down. As COVID-19 spread, then governments around the world started to impose closures and restrictions. And this resulted in factories closing down, and so goods weren't either being produced either at all or in the volumes that were needed to satisfy global demand. International travel was then banned. Airlines and air freight logistics were affected. The strain on supply chains was then amplified by unusual consumer conduct and panic buying. You just have to look back to what happened in Australia in March and April with the toilet paper fiasco to really understand or to see the impact that COVID-19 has had on supply chains. But it's not just issues with getting product into Australia. It's also, there have been issues about moving products around Australia. Coles and Woolworths had problems in getting stock from their central distribution centres into store. And you can still see a little bit of that happening. They had product in their central distribution centres, but because some local councils had restrictions on when deliveries could be made, they weren't able to replenish the shelves as quickly or as often as they would like. So today, I'm going to be talking about some of the legal issues that businesses have been grappling with as a result of these recent supply chain issues. If I can just work out how to move forward. There we go. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about force majeure. I'll then talk a little bit about contract frustration, exclusivity, termination, and then just touch on some other issues that we've seen arise as a result of COVID-19. Firstly, force majeure. So a force majeure event is basically an event that's beyond the reasonable control of a party. Some contracts will include a clause that says that if a force majeure event occurs and that a party is unable to perform a contract, then that party's obligation to perform will be suspended. Now, whether a force majeure clause will operate or be triggered by COVID-19 will really depend on the wording of the clause. Some clauses or some contracts will define force majeure quite broadly, and they'll use language like an event beyond the reasonable control of a party. And if that wording is used, then it would most likely include COVID-19. But other definitions of force majeure events are much narrower in scope. And they use language like act of God. And there are cases where, or there are cases which indicate that this expression, an act of God, means things like storms and flooding and lightning, tsunamis, cyclones. They tend to be more weather type events. And so you wouldn't necessarily think that COVID-19 would fall within that definition or that description of act of God. However, there are also some other cases where illness has been held to be an act of God. So it really depends on the wording of the force majeure clause, and it will depend on the interpretation of a court. And as far as I know at this stage, I'm not aware of any court decisions that have necessarily held that COVID-19 is considered to be an act of God. Other ways that force majeure events are narrowly defined, some of them actually refer to epidemics or pandemics. So, you know, if you have a clause that just says that a force majeure event includes a pandemic, well then obviously COVID-19 would fall within that definition. But if you're looking to try and get some relief because of some obligation that you had before the World Health Organization declared a pandemic, which was on the 11th of March, well then you might not fall within that, you might not get relief from that force majeure event clause. So for the most part, COVID-19 I think is something that's likely to be considered to be a force majeure event, because a lot of clauses actually are quite broadly worded, even though they might refer to specific things like acts of God and pandemics and epidemics and the like. But just because you then fall within the definition of force majeure event, if a COVID-19 is a force majeure event, the big question becomes, does that prevent a party from performing its obligations? And if the answer is yes, then often a force majeure clause will say that the obligation to perform is suspended. So then you just kind of in this suspended state. You don't have to perform your obligations, and that can last indefinitely. But some clauses actually go on further to say that if a force majeure event continues for a particular period of time, whether it be 30 days or 3 months or some other period, then it may give a party a right to terminate. But it really depends on the wording of the clause and what rights the force majeure event clause gives a party. I've got to say, however, that most force majeure clauses that we see really just have a right to suspend performance. A lot of force majeure clauses don't actually go on to allow termination. The next issue I just want to talk about is contract frustration. And if you don't have a force majeure event clause in your supply contract and you're looking for some kind of remedy and the other party is unable to perform their obligations, or you just want to try and get out of the contract, you might be able to rely on the doctrine of contract frustration. A frustrated contract is a contract that, without fault of either party, becomes incapable of being performed due to an unforeseen event, resulting in the obligations under the contract being radically different from those contemplated by the parties when they first entered the contract. The legal consequence of a contract that's been frustrated is that the contract is automatically terminated. However, establishing frustration can be difficult, as it does not apply just because you suffer hardship. So the fact that you might be able to perform the contract, or just because of the way that you can perform the contract has been affected, and perhaps the burden of performance has increased, like the cost of performance might have increased because now you need to do additional things, or the cost of supplying someone has gone up because logistics costs have increased. Doesn't necessarily mean that the contract is frustrated. There has to be something more. The contract has to become commercially impossible or radically different from anything that was contemplated at the time when you entered the contract. So the doctrine of frustration can be applied, but when it is applied, it's within very narrow limits. So for a party to succeed in claiming frustration, you have to show that the party has never agreed to be bound in the fundamentally different situation that has unexpectedly emerged. So it can be very difficult to prove, and so it's not a common remedy. The next issue I want to touch on is exclusivity. And that has become an issue in some supply contracts that we've been helping our clients with. When a supply contract is affected, the most obvious thing to do is to look for an alternative source of supply. That's what most of our clients have been doing, since January. So when their supply chains have been hit or affected in a bad way, they try and source goods or their products from a different source. But some contracts, supply contracts, are exclusive. And when that happens, well, then you can't necessarily go out and look for an alternate source of supply. Having an exclusive contract isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, in normal trading conditions, having exclusivity can be a fantastic thing. From the supplier's point of view, you have a committed distributor who's dedicated to your products. And from the distributor's point of view, you know that you're not spending money on marketing for products that people can buy from someone else. So you know that your marketing dollar will always derive, hopefully, a benefit directly for you. But when there's a supply chain issue between those two parties, well, then it sometimes isn't so good. And if the supply chain can be considered, or if the issue can be considered to be a force majeure event, then depending on your contract, you may or may not be able to suspend performance, or you might be able to get out of the contract. But again, it really depends on those things like force majeure clauses and whether a contract has been frustrated. But if you're stuck in an exclusive arrangement, then you may not necessarily be able to force or to claim a force majeure, but you might be able to suspend the services in some way. So you just need to have a think about how is the non-supply affecting my obligations under the contract? Do I have some kind of KPI performance obligations that I can't now meet because I'm not able to get or source product from the supplier? But one of the things I would stress is that if you're in a supply agreement, which is exclusive, then the most important thing is that you don't breach it if you want it to continue. Don't breach it. I think the best thing to do is to talk with the supplier, or if you're the supplier and you're having issues with your distributor, talk with the distributor and work through the issues. If you're keen to get out of the arrangement, then again, I think the best thing to do would be to talk with the other party and be upfront with them about the issues that are affecting you and the reasons why you can't perform your obligations under the agreement. You might be able to reach some agreement about mutual termination or suspension of performance, but before you do that, you should obviously check what kind of rights to terminate either party has. That brings me on to the next issue that I wanted to talk about, which was termination. And one thing that we've seen with COVID-19 is a lot of parties looking or ringing us up about, can we get out of this contract? We haven't been able to source product, or we haven't been able to meet our performance obligations, or the cost of performance is now so high that we can't make a dollar out of this venture anymore. How do we get out of this arrangement? The most important thing is not to rush termination. Termination can be tricky. You really need to check the terms of the contract to make sure that you have a right to terminate, because too often we see a party looking to terminate or purporting that they have a right to terminate, and then that backfiring on them. And I'll explain this, try and explain this a little bit more now. There is a doctrine or a thing called repudiation of a contract. And repudiation of a contract occurs where the conduct of a party indicates an unwillingness or an inability to render substantial performance of the contract, or where there's conduct that shows an intention to no longer be bound by a contract or to fulfill it only in a very minimal way. So if you're a party who purports that you have a right to terminate a contract, that could be considered to be repudiation, because you might be indicating an unwillingness to perform the contract or an intention to no longer be bound by the contract. If that happens, if you repudiate a contract, then the other party gets rights to terminate and to possibly sue you for damages. So terminating a contract can be very tricky, and you just need to make sure that when you're terminating a contract, you're doing so on firm ground. So the first thing you need to do when you want to think about termination is carefully consider what rights of termination you have under the contract. I should also just point out that there have been some issues around concern about the ability of a party to pay an insolvency. And in Australia, just one thing to bear in mind is that you can't actually terminate a contract just because the other party has become insolvent or might be subject to voluntary administration and those kinds of things. Clauses that talk about the ability to terminate if a party becomes insolvent are called ipso facto clauses. And a couple of years ago, some legislation was passed to put a stay on enforcement of those clauses. The reasoning behind that was to enable businesses that are facing bankruptcy or insolvency the ability to trade out of bankruptcy or insolvency. Now, so the thinking was that other parties shouldn't just be able to terminate a contract just because one party has become insolvent. You can terminate, of course, if they don't pay you on time, but you can't terminate just because they've gone into administration or insolvency. The last things that I just wanted to talk about was just around the impact that COVID has had or might have on a party's ability to meet minimum order targets or other KPIs. Obviously, if you can't get supply of product, then you might not be able to sell the product. Similarly, we've seen in COVID that some businesses have really flourished as a result of COVID, and their products are flying off the shelves. Other businesses, have the sale of their products has fallen down, and they may not be meeting some KPIs that have been imposed on them by the supplier of those products. As I mentioned before, I think the best thing to do is to let the supplier know, and we have helped a number of our clients write to suppliers indicating that COVID-19 is an event that's beyond the control of our clients, and that as a result of that, they're not going to be able to meet the KPIs. And that has opened then up a dialogue with the supplier to then, talk about, the continuation of the contract and how the parties can continue to work together. Another issue that we've seen is around pricing and the increase in logistics costs of either importing product into Australia or distributing it around Australia. And obviously, for some businesses, that has affected their profit margin, and they've looked to see if they could increase pricing. But again, you need obviously to check your contracts to see what you can do about increased pricing. Sometimes it's easier said than done. But, one of the things that we've been helping clients with is starting a dialogue either with suppliers or with their customers around pricing. And look, that's all I wanted to sort of raise for the time being. And I will now hand you over to Michelle.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very insightful. And thank you very much, Gavin, as well. Good morning, everyone. I'd just like to thank the organisers to give me the opportunity to talk to you about the issues that most of the importers and exporters would currently be experiencing. My aim is to give you just a general overview of the current situation and the huge impact that COVID-19 is having and has had already on the transport industry as a whole, and how these effects filter through the supply chain to the importers and exporters in Australia as well. Now, I know it's a very glum topic, and you know, I think it's important to start off with a little bit of positivity. There will be a time that, you know, when everything goes back to normal, and I think, you know, once it does, there will be a huge increase in demand for international freight. So we do believe that, you know, that time will come, hopefully sooner than later, and I think it's gonna go back to normal, and it's gonna be booming. So just quickly an overview on the topics that I would like to discuss today. We're looking at air freight, impact on ocean freight, domestic transport, some of the risks that you might encounter during these times. We're looking at laws and regulations. There's a little bit of what you can do, and then obviously the light at the end of the tunnel as well. So these are the topics I'll touch on. It's only obviously very short. It will just be a very broad overview of the current situation and a bit of an outlook into the near future. And obviously I would like to encourage everyone, if you have any further questions, to please submit these separately, and I will then try to answer them as well. So let's get started with air freight. I guess the dramatic travel restrictions and the collapse of passenger demand have severely limited cargo capacity. And with this, vital cargo capacity has completely disappeared. The world's fleet of freighter aircraft has been mobilized to make up this capacity shortfall. However, capacities are nowhere near enough to cope with the global air freight volumes. There's a huge increase in charter aircraft in order to deal with some of the cargo overflow. Rates are incredibly volatile, having doubled, tripled, or even worse, and are revised and updated on a daily basis, sometimes nearly hourly as well. The current market situation shows massive declines of volumes, which is to be expected to probably get worse still. A lot of importers and exporters are trying to avoid air freight at all costs because of the massive increase in air freight rates. And the aviation industry as a whole is in serious strife and predicts huge monetary losses, as well as losses of jobs as well. So there's definitely massive impact, especially on the air freight side. Moving over to sea freight, the two main issues we've seen with sea freight transport relates to reduced capacity by carriers, which introduced blank sailings, and also an imbalance of equipment, the shipping containers. So blank sailings, just to quickly explain that, is a term that is used to describe a cancellation of a sailing where one port is skipped or the entire string of port calls is cancelled. And this is a tactic employed by shipping lines when demand is low, due to decreased volumes, when there's just not enough freight to be moved. And the other point is the imbalance of equipment, and that was mainly caused by the lack of Chinese exports, which meant that the containers that would have usually made their way to the US and to Europe just didn't move. Which resulted in a huge shortage of containers in Europe, the US, and also in Australia as well. I'm happy to obviously report that this has improved, that both points have improved, especially now with China coming back on board. We've certainly seen an improvement in that regard. The industry generally is suffering. Reliability has been impacted as a probably the most important point, and that again is due to withdrawn or blank sailings. And shipping lines are extending transit times as well on some sailings to avoid additional costs and reduce their overheads. We're just moving on to domestic transport. And with domestic transport, we haven't actually seen a massive impact when it comes to transport. It's very important that the transport has been looked at as one of the essential services, which meant that, you know, even though the states initially closed their borders, they were trying to sort of have goods move very freely to ensure that logistics and supply chains were still operating, as this was very much an essential point of domestic movements. And look, in the meantime, even though there's some states that are still closed, domestic transport is moving, it's working, and they approach it with a sort of a wave through sort of a procedure where international freight is allowed to pass borders unhindered. There were some delays initially, but this has certainly stopped. Now, some of the risks, and look, Michael has already touched on quite a few of those, but I just want to rephrase and revisit that from a transport point of view as well. I mean, the main risks or main issues that we are seeing that impact our clients is basically delays and increased costs, which I already touched on before, both in air freight and sea freight. And obviously, both of these points can have contractual impacts with supply chain agreements. So what we generally suggest is to seek the conversation with the other contractual party as soon as possible, so that these issues can be touched on early and discussed, so that a suitable solution can be found without it escalating into illegal issues. And obviously also one point that is really important that Michael touched on before, force majeure may not automatically apply. So this will very much depend on the clauses that are included in your contracts. So that's something that needs to definitely be looked at. And in general, look, with any contractual issues, we strongly advise to seek legal assistance to review existing contracts and potential risks therein as well. When it comes to laws and regulations, there have been a few implementation that affect international transport and clearance as such. So there was a new bylaw that Customs introduced to seek tariff relief for products used to fight COVID-19. It's very important to look at these export prohibitions that have been put in place. So certain items that have been seen as essential to fight COVID-19 cannot just be exported. There's some exemptions there, but that needs to be discussed on a case-by-case basis. And then obviously it's very important if you're planning to import any COVID-19 testing kits. There are very strong regulations as to what is allowed to be imported and what is not. So that's, again, is very important to be looked at with a licensed customs broker, to make sure that you're not running into any issues when your goods are sitting at the border and can't be brought in. Now, what can you do? Look, as I said before, I mean, preparation is really everything. It's important you review your supply chain in detail and sort of look at potential risk points. You need to discuss the supply chain situation with your factory, with your supplier, with the consignee, with your client. And the more you can discuss it, the more you can come up with potential solutions to get around any issues. You need to review your contractual obligations to your clients to make sure that there's no issues that might come up or have already come up. Identify potential weak points along your supply chain. Again, liaise with legal professionals, especially when it comes to contractual issues or concerns, and obviously discuss any current options, potential delays, and cost impacts with your freight forwarder. I mean, they would know at the moment what is working, what doesn't work, where there's risks and where there's explosions of costs as well. So they will be able to advise you a little bit on the impact it will have on your individual supply chain as well. As I said before, look, there is definitely light at the end of the tunnel. We have seen very positive signs recently, obviously, especially with with China factories pretty much being back up and running. Sea freight sort of capacity and volumes have returned to near normal levels. There's still some regional restrictions obviously in place that need to be looked at case by case, but I think everyone understands that transport and supply chain is absolutely essential to the economy of all affected countries. And I think there was a huge push to make sure that there was measures put in place to ensure transport wouldn't be restricted. So we do see quite a few positive signs. However, there's still concerns, especially when it comes around air freight volumes, capacity, and freight rates. So that's definitely something to still be aware of. If there's any questions, as I said before, please submit your questions either directly to myself or via the webinar hosting page, and I'll be more than happy to discuss that separately. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Michael, for two very interesting and insightful presentations. So following that content, what we're going to do now is have a short Q&A session with Michael and Michelle. So to kick that off, I have a question for Michael first up. Michael, a business's approach to the legal considerations you discussed will be different depending on whether it's a customer or a supplier. And in many instances, businesses will be both. And as a result, we'll need to consider both perspectives. So what do companies need to consider for long-term success in navigating through the legal and broader risk management issues in the COVID-19 environment and into the post-COVID-19 environment?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Gavin. Look, that's quite a broad question, but I'll assume that the question is directed more towards to supply chain risk management rather than just risk management generally. But when it comes to supply chain risks, I think that regardless of where you sit in the supply chain, you just need to understand what your supply chain looks like so that you can then assess the chain and work out where the high risk touch points are. It's not an easy task, and I think if you can, then a business should have someone in that business who's dedicated towards supply chain management. That would be someone who can review the supply chain or audit the supply chain and look at and work out basically what the strengths and weaknesses are. Not every supply chain is the same, so obviously high risk touch points are different depending on what industry you're in, and I'll try and give some example of that. Pharma companies, they operate in a highly regulated environment, so making changes to a supply chain can be really tricky because they need to make sure that manufacturers meet certain standards. They need to make sure that the manufacturer are registered with regulators like the TGA and that kind of thing. So it's not easy for a pharma company to necessarily change very quickly, so the supply chain is very rigid often. For fast-moving consumer goods, for that industry, when you're talking about perishables like food and those types of products, supply chains are all about speed and agility, and so they tend to have shorter supply chains, and often changing supply chains can be quick and swift depending on the circumstances. If the supply chain involves a foreign country, then there's a bunch of other risks that you need to think about, like sovereignty risk and the risk of government intervention or political risks. So yeah, what I'm trying to sort of point out is the fact that every supply chain will be different. Supply chain risk is different depending on your industry and the type of supply chain you have. And I know that in Australia there's been a bit of talk about wanting to bring manufacturing back to Australia, because that will, prevent some of the issues that people have been having. Michelle kind of mentioned that there's been a lot of issues with air freight, and that usually happens when you're talking about international supply chains. And people are talking about bringing manufacturing back to Australia because that'll avoid some of the risk. But I think while that might happen to a certain extent, I think it'd be fanciful to think that international trade will dry up. I just don't think that's going to happen. But I think people need to start now thinking about, okay, if I have a link in my supply chain that's in a foreign jurisdiction, you really need to do your DD on that party. So you got to do a full due diligence. You got to know who you're dealing with, and you got to make sure that you have a plan B. Because I think people will now be a lot more wary about, the things that could go wrong, and the fact then that, this reliable supplier who supplies people all around the world, may not be able to supply anymore. So I think that'll be interesting, and people will need, I think they should be asking their suppliers for business continuity or disaster recovery plans. And in particular, if you're heavily reliant on a particular supplier, then you just need to plan for disruption. That's something I think that people need to in particular be looking at. Other things, some people are talking about building up stock, having extended warehouse capacity, all those types of things. But again, they're just ways of trying to mitigate the risk. So if I can boil that down, I know I've sort of rambled on for a little bit, but if I boiled that down to 4 things, I would say, have a dedicated supply chain manager who look after your supply chain and work out where the risk points are. Have a system for reviewing that, make sure you have plans to mitigate risk, and so that you identify where the weak spots are and have a plan B. I wouldn't be a lawyer if I didn't say document the arrangements as best as possible. It's good to have a contract. Think about things like what I spoke about before, force majeure, look at termination rights, think about exclusivity. Is that the best thing in the particular circumstances? As I said, it can be good, but not sometimes it's not so good. But the most important thing, I think, is just making sure you have a good relationship with your supplier and people in your supply chain, because I've found that our clients who have good relationships have been the ones who've been able to negotiate and talk through the issues with their either their distributors or their suppliers, and have been able to work out a commercial way forward. I will just lastly, I just wanted to say one thing. COVID-19 isn't the only disruptor to supply chains. And, we've had Brexit, we've had US-China trade wars, we've had our fair share of natural disasters like earthquakes and floods and bushfires. So there has already been quite a lot of disruption to supply chains over the last, 6 months, 12 months or so. I think COVID has just really highlighted some of those things. And supply chain management and resilience, I think they're certainly leading themes with a lot of larger global businesses. Yeah, thanks, Gavin.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for that thorough and very helpful response. Now I have a question for Michelle. Michelle, many businesses have found it difficult to manage supply shortages as a result of the impact of the pandemic. And it seems likely that COVID-19 outbreak will influence thinking around supply chain design and management, and no doubt encourage companies to seek greater geographical diversification in their supply chains. Michelle, what are some of the things that managers and key decision makers can do to protect their company in this regard, as well as avoid future risks in their supply chains?
Thanks, Gavin. It's a very good question, because I think it is a very important point, and as Michael already pointed to as well, COVID is not the only disruptor. So I think it's important to look at your supply chain as a whole, and every supply chain is slightly different, and you have to identify the potential risk points along the supply chain as well, and your individual options of how you can mitigate those risks. As Michael said as well, I mean, one option could potentially be to hold more stock in Australia, but that might not be possible for everyone, because they might rely on fast-moving goods they're not able or don't have the required premises to hold large amounts of stock. So it's really important to look at it individually, and everyone needs to look at their own supply chain and have a look for weak points. But look, ultimately, planning is the key. You know, it's really hard to predict what the future will hold. We do expect that the issues will prevail for a little while to come, and I guess it affects all modes of transport. But I think we have to be very clear to identify that the pandemic or the impact of the pandemic has especially affected air freight due to the global travel bans. So that has affected capacity, availability, and ultimately costs as well. So there were some disruptions when it came to ocean freight. They were nowhere near as severe as it was with air freight. So just to give a very general answer, I mean, diversification is definitely the key. Not only from a geographical point of view, you might want to have a backup to a certain supplier sitting in a certain area of the world in case there is certain effects that would make it impossible for them to supply the goods to you. And I think it's also, diversification is also important when it comes to modes of transport. You don't want to just rely on air freight for everything. You don't want to rely on sea freight for everything. You want to be able to have a little bit of both, or have at least the option to quickly switch between those two, and that obviously has to flow through to your to your supply chain contracts as well. Because that's obviously something you have to look at very carefully when you select the mode of transport. How quickly do you have to deliver, and what sort of delivery requirements and timelines are in place currently?
Gavin, might be on mute.
I think you're on mute, Gavin.
Sorry, everybody, I was just on mute. Thank you, Michelle, for that response. That brings us to the end of our event for today. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact Michael or Michelle directly, or me. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you can complete that to provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar along with the handouts. So, on behalf of Bartier Perry, thank you for joining us today, and I do hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks.